In August 1942, the Solomon Islands were a humid emerald blur on the map, a place the world had never heard of. But to the Allied High Command, one specific island, Guadalcanal, had become the most dangerous piece of land on Earth. The Japanese were building an airfield at Lunga Point. If those bombers took off, they could sever the lifeline between America and Australia, effectively winning the war in the South Pacific before it had truly begun. This was the start of the Lunga Point gamble. The men assigned to stop them were the 1st Marine Division. Most of them were teenagers, led by veterans of the Great War, and they were heading into the unknown. On August 7th, as the morning mist lifted, the Marines hit the beaches. To their shock, the landing was unopposed. They moved through the suffocating heat of the coconut groves, seizing the half-finished runway, later named Henderson Field, with ease. It felt like a walkover. But the gamble was just beginning. On the second night, the horizon erupted in a terrifying display of white and orange fire. The Battle of Savo Island was underway. In the matter of hours, a Japanese cruiser force decimated the Allied fleet, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and sending the rest of the Navy fleeing for safety. The Marines stood on the shore, watching the silhouettes of their own supply ships disappearing into the darkness. They were alone. They called themselves the Cactus Air Force and the Abandoned. They were stranded on a mosquito-infested rock with only a few weeks of rations, limited ammunition, and a half-finished airfield. The Japanese commanders, meanwhile, viewed the Marines with utter contempt. They believed the Americans were luxury-loving and would crumble under the first sign of Japanese seishin, or fighting spirit. This was the first great psychological clash of the war. The Marines dug in round the Lunga perimeter. The jungle was a sensory nightmare. At night, it breathed with the sounds of strange birds and the rustle of land crabs, but every snap of a twig felt like a Japanese bayonet. They were starving, eating captured Japanese rice infested with weevils, and shaking with the first chills of malaria. Yet, as they improved the muddy runway with their bare hands and captured equipment, a grim transformation took place. The Lunga Point gamble was the moment the U.S. Marines realized they weren't just fighting for an airfield, they were fighting for their lives. They became the first Americans to prove that the Imperial Japanese Army was not an invincible ghost. As the first Japanese reinforcements began to land down the coast, the Marines checked their weapons and waited in the mud. The gamble had been made, the Navy was gone, and the jungle was about to scream.
By late August 1942, the Japanese High Command was convinced that the American presence on Guadalcanal was a minor nuisance that could be swiped away with a single sharp blow. They dispatched Colonel Kianao Ichiki and his elite detachment, nearly 1,000 veteran soldiers who had never known defeat. Ichiki's doctrine was simple. The spiritual power of the Japanese bayonet was superior to any amount of American steel. He believed that the Marines were soft and that a sudden, terrifying night assault would send them fleeing back to their ships. This was the birth and the bloody end of the myth of the night attack. On the night of August 21st, the air around the Ilu River, which the Marines mistakenly called the Tenaru, was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Across a narrow sandbar that separated the river from the ocean, the 1st Marine Division's 2nd Battalion sat in their foxholes, peering into the pitch-black jungle. Suddenly, a flare hissed into the sky, bathing the sandbar in a haunting artificial light. Through the tall grass, hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged, screaming "Banzai!" and charging forward with bayonets fixed. This was the moment Ichiki had envisioned, a mass of screaming warriors designed to shatter the American spirit. But the Marines didn't run. Instead, they opened up with everything they had. The sandbar became a killing field. M1917 Browning machine guns barked in a steady, rhythmic roar, scything through the ranks of the charging Ichiki detachment. The Japanese soldiers, driven by a blind devotion to their code, charged again and again, stepping over the piles of their own fallen comrades. The carnage was absolute. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Army encountered the devastating reality of American firepower. Marine Private Al Schmid, though blinded by a grenade, continued to fire his machine gun, guided by the shouted directions of his comrades. The spirit of the bayonet was being systematically dismantled by the industrial reality of the canister shot and the 37mm anti-tank guns. As dawn broke over the coconut groves, the myth was dead. The Ilu River was choked with bodies, and the elite Ichiki detachment had been virtually annihilated. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the magnitude of his failure and the shattering of his tactical beliefs, burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. The Battle of the Tenaru was a psychological earthquake for the Japanese. They had expected a weak enemy that would crumble under fear. They found instead a wall of fire and a brand of grit that matched their own. This chapter marked the end of Japanese overconfidence on Guadalcanal. They realized that the luxury-loving Americans would not be scared away in the night. The war in the Pacific had changed. It was no longer about who had the most spirit, but who could endure the most hell and still keep firing. By September 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal had reached a breaking point. The 1st Marine Division was no longer the fresh force that had landed in August. They were the walking dead, men hollowed out by malaria, malnutrition, and the relentless humidity of the Solomon Islands. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies, and their ribs protruded from skin turned yellow by atabrine tablets. This was the setting for Bloody Ridge and the edge of exhaustion, the most desperate defensive stand in the history of the campaign. The focus of the struggle was a grassy limestone ridge that rose like a spine just south of Henderson Field. Command of this vital high ground fell to Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson and his elite raiders and parachutists. Edson knew that if the Japanese took this ridge, they could look down the barrels of their guns directly onto the airfield and end the American presence on the island forever. He moved his 800 exhausted men onto the slopes and told them simply, "This is it. There is no place else to go." Opposing them was General Kiyotake Kawaguchi and a force of over 2,000 veteran infantrymen. Kawaguchi, having learned from the disaster at the Tenaru, planned a massive, coordinated night assault. On the night of September 12th, the jungle erupted. The Japanese launched a series of ferocious waves, using smoke and flares to create a chaotic, hellish atmosphere. They screamed "Banzai" and "U.S. Marine, you die" as they threw themselves against the American lines. The fighting was primal. It devolved into a series of disconnected hand-to-hand struggles in the tall kunai grass. Marines used bayonets, trench knives, and even helmets swung as clubs to hold their ground. Edson moved among his men in the thick of the fire, his voice rasping through the smoke, refusing to let the line buckle. By the second night, the ridge was a scene of slaughter. The Japanese had nearly reached the command post, but the Marines held the crest by their fingernails, supported by the devastating roar of the 105mm howitzers of the 11th Marines firing from the valley below.
When the sun rose over the ridge, the sight was haunting. The slopes were covered in the bodies of the fallen, earning the landmark its permanent name, Bloody Ridge. Kawaguchi's brigade had been shattered, retreating back into the green hell of the jungle. For the Japanese High Command, the failure at Bloody Ridge was a psychological catastrophe. They had thrown their best troops against a starving, sick, and isolated enemy, and they had been repulsed. The edge of exhaustion had been reached, but the Marines had not broken. The realization was beginning to dawn on the Japanese. They were not just fighting a military. They were fighting a breed of men who would rather die in the mud than take a single step backward.
By October 1942, the tropical paradise of Guadalcanal had transformed into a grotesque landscape of decay. While the Marines struggled with hunger, the Imperial Japanese Army was descending into a nightmare of absolute deprivation. This was the era of the Green Hell, a period where the greatest enemy wasn't the bullet or the bayonet, but the total collapse of Japanese logistics. The High Command in Tokyo had sent thousands of elite soldiers to the island, but they had failed to send the one thing they needed most to survive: food. The Japanese soldiers began to call the island Jikoshima, Starvation Island. The Tokyo Express, the fast destroyers that slipped through the darkness to deliver reinforcements, could only carry so much. Often they would drop supplies in buoyant metal drums, hoping the tide would carry them to shore. But the American Cactus Air Force and PT boats sank the drums before the starving soldiers could reach them. The jungle, which the Japanese had hoped would be their ally, turned into a silent executioner. Inside the dense vine-choked interior, the Japanese 17th Army was wasting away. Men who had once marched proudly through the streets of Nanjing and Singapore were now reduced to crawling through the mud, searching for edible roots, palm hearts, or even blades of grass. Dysentery and malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire. A Japanese soldier's diary from this time captured the horror. "We are eating the bark of trees. Those who cannot walk are left where they fall. Every day the jungle grows thicker with the smell of death." The psychological toll of the Green Hell was devastating. The Japanese military code, Bushido, demanded that a soldier die in battle, but there was no honor in dying of beriberi in a muddy hole. General Harukichi Hyakutake, the commander of the 17th Army, sat in his jungle headquarters watching his finest units dissolve into ghosts. He realized that the Americans were not just winning the battles, they were winning the war of attrition. The U.S. Navy was slowly tightening a noose around the island, cutting off the flow of rice and ammunition, until the Japanese soldiers were essentially the living dead. This logistic collapse was the moment the Japanese leadership realized they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. They had relied on spirit to overcome material shortages, but spirit could not stop the ravages of starvation. As the Japanese soldiers looked out from the jungle at the American perimeter, they saw the Marines receiving hot meals and fresh supplies brought in by transport planes. The contrast was a crushing blow to their morale. The Green Hell was a grim testament to the cost of overextension. By the time the Japanese High Command finally ordered an evacuation, they weren't rescuing an army, they were retrieving the broken remnants of one. The jungle had claimed more Japanese lives than American machine guns ever could. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard of imperial ambition, proving that in the Pacific, the most lethal weapon was not the sword, but the supply line.
By January 1943, the humid air over Guadalcanal carried a different scent, not just the rot of the jungle, but the unmistakable smell of defeat.
The Imperial Japanese High Command, after 6 months of blood and starvation, had reached a conclusion that shook the very foundations of the empire. Guadalcanal was lost. This was the final reckoning, the moment the rising sun reached its zenith and began its long, violent descent. In the secret chambers of Tokyo, Hirohito made a rare and somber intervention. He authorized Operation K, a full-scale withdrawal. It was a bitter pill for a military that had never surrendered an inch of soil. The plan was a masterpiece of deception. For weeks, the Japanese Tokyo Express destroyers ramped up their activity, making the Americans believe a massive new offensive was coming. In reality, they were slipping into the dark coves of Cape Esperance to evacuate the broken survivors. On the nights of early February, nearly 11,000 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle like phantoms. These were not the proud warriors who had landed months earlier. They were skeletal figures, their uniforms in tatters, many unable to walk. As they were ferried to the waiting destroyers, they looked back at the jagged peaks of the island one last time. Behind them, they left 20,000 of their comrades buried in the green hell. When the U.S. Marines and Army troops finally pushed to the western tip of the island on February 9th, they found only silence and abandoned equipment. General Alexander Patch sent a simple 2-word telegram to his superiors. Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. The turning tide was not just a territorial gain, it was a psychological revolution. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Japanese soldier had been obliterated on land, at sea, and in the air. The United States had proven that it could take the worst the empire could throw and stay standing. Japan had lost its elite carrier pilots, its veteran infantry, and most importantly, the strategic initiative. They would spend the rest of the war on the defensive, retreating from one island to the next until the fire reached Tokyo itself. Admiral Toshikazu Omai later admitted, "After Guadalcanal, we no longer felt we could win. We only felt we could delay." The road to Tokyo was still long and bloody, but it began in the mud of Lunga Point. The final reckoning had arrived, and the world now knew that the rising sun was no longer rising, it was setting.